Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Ibrahim Aoude. Imperial Designs, Iraq, Lebanon and beyond. We have two guests who will be discussing the topic with us. Farideh Farhi, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at the University of Hawai'i, and Ramsis Lutfy, Retired Professor of Zoology. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And here we are again, discussing the situation in the Middle East and the relationship of the United States, Israel to the Middle East, especially Arab countries, Iran, and so on. And so it would be good perhaps to begin with the president's speech that he did yesterday, September 11th, and to see what might come out of that in terms of like policies for the future as regards the Middle East and also as regards America as well. So Farideh, you visited Iran also, so you have like a fresh outlook on the question of Iran. And of course you've been there so many times and you lived there. And Ramses, you are a keen observer of what goes on in the Middle East and the relationship of U.S. foreign policy to the Middle East. So perhaps we then could begin with Bush's speech and what is your take on it? Maybe we'll start with you, Farideh.
I think the most important aspect of Mr. Bush's speech, and not only the ones yesterday, but a whole series of them that have come about because the campaign season have begun, is that there are several dynamics at work here. One, obviously, there is this real concern in relationship to the election that is coming up in the United States and the Republican understanding that in order to win the election, they have to scare the American people as much as possible. And clearly that has meant a combination of speeches regarding all the scary things that are going on in the Middle East and lumping together of many trends that have gone on in the Middle East that are maybe related to each other but are extremely different things. And that is what the Bush administration has done consistently in the Middle East in the past 5 years. That's why American foreign policy is so much trouble in the Middle East, because they have brought together ideas of, specific non-state terrorism like Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda terrorism with what is going on in Iraq, and then later on connecting it to social movements that exist in countries like Lebanon, without making any kind of differentiation about the particular contexts that are involved, and ultimately leading American foreign policy in a direction that has become extremely dangerous in relationship to the Middle East. So I think this important disjunction that exists in American foreign policy, which is you have an American president essentially talking to an American audience because he's interested in re-election or his party's re-election, not understanding or not caring about the consequences of that kind of policy in relationship to the Middle East, is a situation where has brought us here and has created a very, very dangerous situation.
I think that's good from that perspective of how the U.S. is thinking. It seems to me also that there is this relationship between domestic and foreign policy, and I think the White House knows that. But in a sense, there is this disjunction as well that you talked about, because it seems to me what they want to do, the Americans, the foreign policy makers, is try to impose their understanding of things and their strategy on the Middle Eastern states and on the Middle Eastern people as a whole. So Ramses, would you agree with that, and what else would you say?
I do agree with that, and it's very strange that President Bush seems to be getting further and further from logical sort of interpretations. And he thinks that he can convince the public opinion in America or at least, I mean, I don't know if he's trying or not, but he's going through the motion. But every time he speaks now, he's digging himself a deeper hole, because people are not, or at least a large percentage of the public opinion, do not believe what he says anymore. And at the same time, when he says that we have to stay the course, and it's very important for the United States to fight terrorism, the next day, that's today, we hear that the American forces are leaving the Anbar province completely because it has become hopeless for them. And of course, they make things, I mean, excuses like saying, anyway, we hadn't sort of ever been in control of Anbar province. I mean, so you are going to occupy Iraq except Anbar province, or what it is?
A huge province.
Yes, of course.
And the other thing, if I may, I mean, after Fallujah 2003, I mean, they destroyed Fallujah and killed a lot of civilians and stuff, the Americans.
Yes.
Yes. And they said we have control over Anbar, or at least Fallujah, but then, the resistance kept growing and growing. So in fact, this is one of the commanders said yesterday, of the Anbar province, American. He said the American forces have all been but defeated.
Yeah.
And
that's
so
exactly
that is a major problem. And then he's speaking, Bush, in a way that really obviates all questions of data, real data, statistics, etc., and what the commanders are saying.
It doesn't come into the picture at all. That, I mean, they are lying about that even. And of course, many of the military officers that are involved there are against the thing, and they are talking that this is not going to lead anywhere. Well, what I can see is that now the United States and Israel, as an alliance, are following this pattern. Attack this country and destroy its infrastructure, bring it back to the Stone Age, and maybe one or two American bases that are disengaged from any local sort of troubles, to keep an eye on the oil in the area.
But okay, so that gives us a context in which we can discuss further. But also there is the question of what happened in Lebanon, and what not only me but other people call the U.S.-Israeli invasion of Lebanon.
Yes.
And this is, I mean, critical. So Lebanon has been destroyed from July 12th till
August
33, August, whenever it was, 33, 34 days later. And then the Americans, the Israelis failed in their mission, although they destroyed all of Lebanon, but they failed in terms of their strategic objectives. And now the Lebanese are more united than ever before, all Christians, Muslims, whoever, against U.S. foreign policy and, of course, against Israel. Even the extreme right-wing, fascist right-wing parties, they didn't dare say anything in Lebanon against Hezbollah, who is a Shiite-based organization. Which is an organization, the Lebanese call it a civil, a resistance movement. And in fact, the president of Lebanon, Aoude, who's a Christian Maronite, he says the same thing.
The resistance movement.
At any rate, I interviewed Ibrahim, he's professor of economics at Capilani Community College, who was stuck in Lebanon during the invasion. So he speaks in terms of the investment that occurred in Lebanon and so on, and what has happened in Lebanon since.
It was heavy investment, totaling about $40 billion from 93 to 2006 or 2005. New bridges, roads, electric plants, fixing the roads, dams, and private construction, a lot of hotels and businesses, And then Israel left Lebanon in 2000. due to the pressure, by the way, of Hezbollah. Talking about Hezbollah, there is misunderstanding here. They always say the bombing of the embassy in 1982 and killing American and French soldiers. The Hezbollah, if they say alleged, even in the United States when they are accurate. So if Hezbollah did that, that's not the same Hezbollah that existed in 2000. At the time was headed by a Tufaili, which he was dismissed out of Hezbollah. And since then, their emphasis is Lebanon and liberating land in Lebanon. They never did any act of violence outside Lebanon. That even alleged, they say alleged, some embassy outside or something. And so in 2000, from 2000 to 2005, the South started to develop more after Israel withdrawal. And you could see the difference. The government is there putting roads and stuff like that. And then all of these were coming to fruition now. They were expecting a lot of tourists, over 1 million tourists, which they spend about $2.5 billion for the season. And so that's gone. So the estimate is the Lebanese government in 2006 would lose income, about 1.5 billion.
Well, all that investment that was in Lebanon from 92, 93 all the way till 2006 was just completely wiped out. Okay. So that's, the question of Lebanon. Ramsis, you followed those kinds of events. So any more comments on this?
Well, actually, although I had anticipated something like that would happen, but at the same time, I couldn't sort of in any way expect that the reaction was going to be that harsh. I thought that it's going to be a raid inside southern Lebanon and sort of trying to break some of the installments that Hezbollah has been using for. But it seems that it had been planned for long before the incident itself happened. And what we found out later is that Israel had planned for reinvasion of Lebanon long before that, and they were just waiting for a trigger, which came with the Hezbollah arresting or taking, well, they say abducted. Yeah. I mean, which is really when imprisonment or abduction or something like that. It's a war. So when it happens, when you do it, it's okay. It's okay. When somebody, your enemy does it, it takes a different labeling.
Right.
But the pattern is going on. Before that, in June, they were hitting Gaza, and no discrimination. Factories, schools, hospitals. Powerhouses, no lights in Gaza. Powerhouses and purification plants and sewage systems and everything. So this is a pattern that we are seeing. It's happening in Iraq, in Palestine, and recently in Lebanon.
Right.
So that seems to be the sort of aim.
Yeah, Seymour Hersh mentioned that these plans have been there from at least a year ago, etc. But Farideh, you wanted to say something.
Well, there is a strategic context here too. That is to say, one has to ask the question of what was the intention of Israeli attack on Lebanon, and of course the immediate decision on the part of Western powers, but particularly to United States, to effectively encourage Israel to go all the way and try to, quote-unquote, finish off Hezbollah. The context here is that some people have argued that this was not only an Israeli-American war against Lebanon, but also a proxy war between United States and Iran, and unfortunately the Lebanese people paid for it. And the idea was, presumably, and that's why it was planned beforehand, that Hezbollah was becoming a problem. But ultimately the real problem, the beyond problem, was Iran and its program, and the fear that if Iran went further in its regional projection of power, Hezbollah would be a powerful force to deter the Israeli from an attack, a direct attack on Iran. Therefore, before the direct attack against Iran, it was necessary to finish off Hezbollah. And that is why, despite the massive destruction of Lebanon, despite all the things, all the military superiority that was clearly exhibited by the Israelis, within the context of Israeli politics, this is considered a loss because Hezbollah was not destroyed. Secondly, and not only it survived, it was very much able to show the kind of vulnerability, military or strategic vulnerability that Israel has because of its size. Therefore, Israel was not only not able to buttress its defenses, but in effect became weakened, despite the fact that it it caused so much harm. But all I'm trying to say is that this sort of further implication, this deeper implication of the Israeli action should not be missed, because we are talking about a country in the Middle East that is very much interested in regional dominance, and at the same time is extremely fearful of another country, which is Iran, which is also very interested in regional dominance. And it is that context that created, unfortunately, this calamity for the Lebanese people.
In fact, Elton Daniel speaks also to this thing, to this point, and I interviewed him, so we'll watch the interview and then we'll comment further.
Okay.
Personally, I would think that the people currently in power in Washington realize they're rapidly running out of time for their plans. They know they're in political trouble coming November, and the next few months seem to me to be really fraught with the possibility of some greater action in the Middle East. That's a possibility. Now, there are other things, of course, in terms of the question that you pose, that are not on quite that grandiose a scale that could happen. The Israelis have essentially said publicly that they want Nasrallah dead. They are still planning to hunt him down and kill him. If any opportunity presents itself, they will. If they do, ceasefire is not going to mean much in that context. They've carried out raids, of course, that were bungled as much as many of the operations during the war, seemingly trying to provoke Hezbollah into doing something so they have an excuse to resume fighting, in which case the ceasefire crumbles. Hezbollah, however, has said it's not going to be dragged into another conflict, and it will not respond to these provocations. The worry, of course, is the peacekeeping force in Lebanon may get into trouble and upset things because it tries to disarm Hezbollah. But that's not the only threat, of course, because you also have to wonder, what are they going to do if you have a robust force there, as people say they want, and they're capable of responding to provocations? What happens if the provocation is coming from the Israeli side? Annan was just there asking that the blockade on Lebanon be lifted. What happens if it doesn't? And there are a lot of issues still still hanging there. There's a lot of potential for trouble, and it could come, you know, in any number of degrees and from any number of places. I guess that's the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, Elton, talking in this particular context with regard to a larger action against Syria and Iran,
sure.
and or Iran, you know,
Yeah.
depending that. But to try and personalize the issue also, Ibrahim Deek, who was stuck in Lebanon during those actions, you know, another segment that he's talking about airstrikes in Lebanon and what he witnessed and so forth. So we'll watch this one, and then we'll talk more about the whole affair.
Then I said, okay, at the time, well, they did airstrike and some incursion into Lebanon, so that 2-3 days, and they will stop. It didn't stop, you know. So then 1 week after, the G8 are meeting in Russia. They said, well, they will discuss, you know, and then they will put pressure and they stop, and they didn't stop. And it seems whatever intention they have to finish in 5 days, because of the heavy resistance of Hezbollah, they could not do it. And so it's like they extended time for them, you know. It's like you have a project someplace, you know, you're building a house or something. As a contractor, you said 5 days, I'll do this lanai for you, and then you didn't finish, and the owner gives him extension. And so that's what the European, and not the European, specifically our country here, United States, kept saying, no, we're changing new Middle East, and et cetera, et cetera. They want to change the rule or the situation on the ground. And they were not able to do that with all the destruction.
So that's like, you know, his experience in there and what needs to be, what he could do, I mean, to get out of there. But then Israel kept going on. In fact, what I want to do is go back to Ibrahim, you know, and watch this other segment. And because like he's talking about, he's stuck in the south of Lebanon, and then go forward from there.
Meanwhile, you know, I'm stuck in the south, I cannot drive. Why cannot I drive? Because they were hitting civilian cars. I saw a car burned with civilians still in them, burned, charred. Finally, Condoleezza Rice, I think, was, in my view, was pushing for some sort of ceasefire. But the administration here, back home in the United States, was resistant, in my view. Condoleezza Rice is talking with the Israelis. They hit Kana, a village killing about 30 people, final count, and most of them children and women. And so she was coming back to Lebanon, and the Lebanese government told her flatly, if you don't have ceasefire, do not come back. And this is a government that is pro-West and pro-United States. And, you know, so it didn't work. So meanwhile, I'm waiting there and say, well, next week. And finally, after Kana, there was 2 days, supposedly, cessation of airstrikes. And I took that opportunity to drive from the south to Beirut to be evacuated by the embassy to Cyprus in a military helicopter.
Okay, I mean, this is like a personalized view of the events. And, you know, Ibrahim Deek is, you know, has been here for years, like 30 years maybe. And he had that particular experience there. So any comments, Ramses?
As Farideh has said before, obviously the Israeli invasion or Israeli-US, or you want to put US before Israel, is a debacle, because it didn't by itself bring any of the purposes that it was launched for. And you can see, number one, Hezbollah's popularity has gone up. At the same time, America's image friendly Arab countries has gone down because they were embarrassed. And at the same time, the invincibility that Israel wanted to boast about and, spread fear in the area because of it has been sort of shattered. So what the terrible thing is that what they didn't achieve militarily, the United Nations did for them diplomatically. That 1707 resolution, 1701, has really brought them what they were looking for. Limiting Hezbollah in a certain area and disarming Hezbollah as much as possible. Getting the United Nations forces to occupy southern Lebanon instead of occupying the land of the aggressor who attacked. They occupied the lands of the defenders. So, I mean, the United Nations has become a very sort of easy tool in the hands of the United States and Israel.
But according to Bush, is that history began on July 12, 2006.
Yeah.
When Hezbollah abducted or whatever it was, those two soldiers and killed a few others. So Farideh, any comments on that?
Well, one has to ask the question at this point, given debacle after debacle, and let us not forget that all these things began in Afghanistan, and we are now today in a situation where we have car bomb after car bomb in Afghanistan as well. Escalating, and there's tremendous amount of tension in Afghanistan too. So you have Afghanistan, you have Iraq, you have Lebanon, and there are also war talk vis-a-vis Iran. So the question becomes, what is American foreign policy? What is the intent of American foreign policy in the region? And it seems to me you can come up with variety of explanations, and none of them end up looking good. That's the problem, okay? I mean, you have to begin with this assumption, and which I think, it's written in American strategic documents, that the Middle East is a very, very important place for United States, and obviously it has to do with one very specific factor, which is oil. So United States is obviously very interested in extending its dominance over the region in a variety of ways. Now, one can look at what has happened in the past few years in those terms and essentially say that this is something, it's a debacle. That is to say, the United States has tried to do that, and then because it did not know the region, because it did not know the consequences, because it felt it could deal with everything militarily, it has led to a debacle and a quagmire. They don't know. The Bush administration does not want to stay and cannot leave in Iraq. So you can look at it in those terms, or you can say, as some conspiracy theorists say in the Middle East, that given the kind of language that is being used at this point, which is, the Middle Easterners, an actual attempt to sort of, as they try to do in the case of Lebanon with the Israeli invasion, try to attack the Shiite population in the hope that the Christian and the Sunni population would go to the other side, that United States has chosen the policy, the old imperial policy of divide and rule, that in fact what is happening in Iraq is, Sunni Shiite fight, so that's, United States finds that,
simplistic,
or sort of fanning the kind of fears that Sunni regimes have in the region against Iran, essentially identifying Iran as a extremist regime a la par with Osama bin Laden, and again, trying to conquer the Middle East through divide and rule. And again, if you take that kind of analysis, that doesn't look good either, because we don't live in a world where you can actually go and divide and rule. Everything is on television. In the old days when they did that, you know, during the times of Sykes-Picot, they did that behind, you know, closed doors, and nobody learned about them until, you know, 50 years later. So now, it's, you know, today, you know, as soon as you go and do it, you know, it's on television everywhere
on the internet.
in the world.
And also a lot of whistleblowers.
Exactly,
right.
exactly. So again, you know, it's not going to work because it is immediately revealed. So that's why there is tremendous amount of confusion on the part of everybody, you know, in Europe, in the Middle East, in the United States, exactly, in terms of what is all these things are about.
I just wanted to clarify when you mentioned Sykes-Picot for the viewers who might not be familiar with the area. It's the British-French agreements to divide, you know, the Ottoman Empire and create different areas of control for both of them. So that's the essential thing about the Sykes-Picot agreement. What I want to do now is go to another segment with Elton Daniel. And he's talking about the need for the U.S. to talk and negotiate, and whether they would negotiate and talk, this is another story.
Yeah, that issue, I mean, this is something many people have written about, and, you know, almost everyone who's a serious and honest expert on the subject tries to argue that, first of all, the United States needs to start talking to people it considers adversaries, be it Hamas or Iran or whatever it may be, but you should at least talk and negotiate with people. And, you know, just ignoring the Iranians is not going to get us anywhere. We should go past that. And the other problem, of course, is that technically everything that we know for sure that Iran is doing is within its rights to do under the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we've just, you know, basically given our blessing to the fact that India doesn't pay any attention to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, you inevitably come around to the conclusion that this is just like Iraq. The threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon is just something that's used as a fear-mongering tactic to cook up public support for military ventures. It really doesn't have anything at all to do with eliminating a weapon of mass destruction. It's eliminating a regime that doesn't agree with you on what the Middle East should look like. And if you were going to be rational about it, what your approach should be is to talk to the Iranians and to concentrate on the legitimate areas of dispute, which is to have an inspections regime that can in fact determine that the program is peaceful. But we're not working towards that end. We're working to having a military strike on them.
Yeah, but that goes back to what you were saying, in fact, how you read U.S. foreign policy in terms of, you know, goals and objectives, right?
Well, Iran poses a real problem. First of all, it's a huge country. Size-wise, it's much larger than Iraq. It is a mountainous country. And it has a population of 70 million people. So the whole notion of, you know, trying to bring about change in Iran through military means is just definitely not possible. First, I mean, for the most important reason that the United States simply does not have the manpower or woman power to do it. There is no way the United States can do this unless it institutes a draft. The second possibility is just, you know, a sort of irrational, illogical step forward because you are in such a mess in such other places. Let's get aggressive in another situation and attack the country through firepower from above, you know, similar to the kind of approach that the Israelis used in Lebanon. You know, they thought that they could get rid of Hezbollah through air attack. In the case of Iran, everybody knows already. They do not have any misconception, even the American military, that an air attack would lead to any kind of destabilization of the regime. In fact, everybody agrees that, like in the case of Lebanon, if you attack a country, the normal reaction of the people is to support their government even further. So if United States indeed attacks Iran and attacks sites that, as Elton Daniel suggested, are already under inspection, okay, that is to say they are sites that everybody knows what's going on, they know they are legal activities, they are not building nuclear weapons, it is truly, truly a very, very desperate effort. But it's a sign of our times that, and the kind of activities that the Bush administration has been engaged in, that rational people are thinking that it's not beyond them.
Yeah, Ramsis.
This brings me back to the point of the sort of failure of the Israeli campaign in Lebanon, the recent one. Well, it's laughable that we heard Condoleezza Rice saying that we are not going to impose a ceasefire now until Israel goes on with its project or its aims. And this is only the pangs of the pain or the pains of birth pangs of the Middle East, or the new Middle East. And of course, this is laughable because actually this exposed the fallacy of what America is pretending to have been doing, which is introducing democracy in the Middle East by interfering militarily, while actually it has been against democracy in the Middle East. Once Hamas was elected, they boycotted it. And they couldn't say that the election of Hamas was irregular or wrongly brought in or something like that. One of the presidents of the United States attended the elections, Carter, and he said that it was above board. And then at the same time, also their friendly cabinet or government in Lebanon, which Bush used to be proud of a few weeks before, was put in a very tenuous and very weak situation. They were embarrassed. They embarrassed their own friend, the government of Lebanon. So what kind of democracy are they seeking?
That's right. But this is the point we've made a number of times on this show too, and that is like, and you mentioned it today, is that the U.S. cannot afford to leave the Middle East. I mean, period. Okay, so what do? Well, you try to dream, have pipe dreams in terms of let's get rid of Hezbollah first so we can attack Iran and so on, So this is leading us to the bigger hole that the U.S. is digging itself in, that to which you referred. And that becomes dangerous. I mean, because who's going to go and fight there? It's not Bush. I mean,
that's it.
It's the youth of this country.
I actually was
for
thinking
what?
of that.
I mean, that is the important thing. And the Lebanon tragedy, I mean, it's a real tragedy for the Lebanese, to be sure, but also in terms of anybody, any country, any people in the Middle East looking at this, they say, well, that's the United States is doing, in cahoots with Israel. So we have to oppose both goals, objectives of Israel and the United States. That would create more of a problem for the United States at a time when the U.S. is trying to fight terrorism. I don't know how you fight terrorism, but that's another story. A war on terrorism, which is like a contradiction. But the thing is that these issues of Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran detract from the fight against terrorists. Let me put it this way. A fight against terrorists. But in his speech, that's why I wanted to start with his speech. Because in his speech, nothing new came about, and he quickly made the wrong relationship between the terrorists and those countries, whether Saddam Hussein or Iran, etc.
Well, I think it does something further than just detracting from the fight for terrorism. Actually, it feeds. It feeds.
Yes, right. I mean, that's why I was mentioning the other stuff.
And, you know, I mean, the kind of dynamics that are at play in the Middle East are very dangerous dynamics. I mean, in that sense, you know, the Bush administration is correct to emphasize the danger. I mean, there is a tremendous amount of pent-up anger in the Middle East that is being turned.
Yeah, they can thank themselves for that.
Exactly.
Course, yeah.
I mean, if, for example, you go to provinces in Pakistan, like Baluchistan, or border provinces with Afghanistan, you actually are seeing a resurgence of very, very radical, angry kind of Islamism that is being fed, you know, children, you know, because of all sorts of dynamics, you know, children poverty and other sorts of stuff, that it will have serious consequences for the future. And the same similar kind of dynamics are at play in Europe, where poorer part of the population are connected to these very violent networks. So we saw examples of that in relationship in England. And also in continental Europe in terms of other, you know, connections in Germany, in Spain, and in France. So these policies are not only, they are dangerous policies. And one has to ask the question, I think, very seriously, why are they being pursued? You know, I mean, there's a very, very clear, you know, you have a conflict in Palestine, you know, you have occupied territories that countries like United States refuse to deal with it. They must know that that feeds anger. You have countries like Iran and Syria that you have to begin talking to. I mean, they are, after all, well-established countries, but you have developed a foreign policy that essentially treats talking to countries as a reward. That is to say, the Bush administration has completely transformed the notion of diplomacy as being the art of talking to your friends as well as enemies, and essentially uses, you know, I'm not going to talk to you because I think, you know, you've been a bad boy, and effectively escalating tensions in an environment that is ready for the fire to catch. And that is why it's very troublesome to watch the whole thing.
In fact, the Americans have done this even with the Palestinians in the 80s. You know, we won't talk with you unless you do this, that, and the other thing.
And they are using it.
Yeah,
We're not talking with Hamas until they recognize Israel.
Right. I mean, this is impossible.
I mean, the whole thing has led to extreme radicalization of the whole area.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to go to Ibrahim's talking about Israel and you know, its destruction of Lebanon and so on, and we'll see what discussion we'll have after that. So we'll go to Ibrahim's.
That didn't work. Actually, the more destructive Israel became and more vicious its attack and more civilians were killed, the more the Lebanese gelled together. You know, even in the first week or second week of the invasion of Lebanon, there was no opposition whatsoever to Hezbollah anymore as fighting to stop Israel. And criticism of Hezbollah stopped. Before that, even Shiite politicians were saying Hezbollah must disarm, must be part of the government, because they have like 12 members of parliament, I think, you know, MPs, and so they are a political party. And so that didn't work. Even right-wing Christian, old Christian militia and leadership did not attack Hezbollah anymore, and everybody was blaming Israel for the war.
Yeah, I mean, so points we made, but just wanted to have you know, Ibrahim discuss this because he was there on that. I want to go before we discuss further. I want to go to a segment by Elton Daniel, And, his idea about how the Bush administration is driven by two agendas at the same time. So we'll do that and then we'll discuss it.
Well, my interpretation of it has generally been that what's happening in the Bush administration is really driven by two agendas. One is this Sharonist idea that you can, and it's backed, of course, by academics like Bernard Lewis and the neoconservatives, all these people, but they have this basic idea that you can sweep away all of the regimes in the Middle East that are hostile to Israel and critical of the United States and replace them with compliant, subservient regimes that will cooperate with the United States and Israel. They have this plan in all sorts of places. And obviously, they've talked about it in the case of Lebanon just recently. This is, again, one of the things that they had in their mind. We destroy Hezbollah, we take them out of the equation in Lebanon, and then Lebanon will sign a peace treaty with Israel. Of course, Senora just told them, we're not signing any. We will be the last Arab country to sign a peace treaty with you. But they still have these kinds of schemes, and they think that's what they can do, that Syria can be replaced, the government in Iran can be replaced, that all of that can be done. And I think, in the service of really a pro-Israeli policy, or what they think will be a pro-Israeli policy, although you could argue in the long run it's actually detrimental to the interest of Israel. But they've been joined by people who see this as an effort not only to do a favor for Israel, but to open up the doors in all sorts of places for American businesses and capitalism that used to be closed to them. We've seen that in Iraq, because one of the first things that they wanted to do was to take all of the nationalized companies and privatize them and turn over all sorts of businesses to private entrepreneurs and bring them in, and all sorts of people thinking they're going to make fortunes by going into these markets and opening them up and using them. What they found out in Iraq, of course, it's a lot easier said than done.
It's largely failed, actually,
yes.
in Iraq, yeah. Especially with the oil thing. I mean, they can't do it.
It's been a disaster, except, of course, for the people who did manage to enrich themselves for a little while they were testing the waters.
Yeah, failed policies that keep repeating themselves. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
So,
although in the case of Iraq, it is true that Iraqi oil has not come online, but a whole lot of American corporations have made money through from American taxpayers.
Yeah.
So that's
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah, right,
But it has not come through the money that is generated out of, or business that is generated out of Iraq. Although Kurdistan, the northern part of Iraq, is thriving.
for now, we shall say.
Yes, yeah.
No, and there are very, very serious discussion about the breakup of Iraq. People have
Yes.
given,
Yes,
that Kurdistan will become an independent state, and of course, the Shiite coalition is
south, yeah.
talking about a federated independent state in the south. But what is, to me, is fascinating because of what Elton was talking about in terms of United States having different groups having different agenda, is that there are also different side effects of the dynamics that are involved. There was this vision about Iraq, which is true, which is all these neoconservatives, pro-Israeli neoconservatives, essentially saying that Iraq will become, quote unquote, an American state, and immediately will be the first state that would recognize Israel. And it would be a secular state, okay? Paul Wolfowitz is essentially saying Iraqi Shiites are not religious at all.
Yeah.
I don't know where he was getting that information. But, it's ironic because today, what do we see today? Today, we see President Bush talking about government of Iraq as the beacon of democracy with hope. And then the other government, the government of Iran, as the major axis of evil. And what do we see today? Mr. Nouri Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq, is in Iran today with the biggest delegation you can imagine, asking the Iranian government, for nothing less than security in Iraq, something that the Americans are not, and of course Iranian business, because so many pilgrims go to Iraq. So that part of the equation was completely missed, because Nouri Maliki spent 10 years in Iran as the opposition figure, very close to the Iranian government, and ultimately you cannot have a policy that calls one country a beacon of democracy and the other one axis of evil, and then have the pictures of these two leaders, you know, shaking hands. You know, how can you combine? You know, that's the illogic of American foreign policy.
We have a caller on the line, Floyd from Hilo. You're on the air. Hello?
Views on people of color, then you won't have this problem. You know, as a Vietnam veteran, when I went to Vietnam, we were engaged in civil rights in Louisiana, where I grew up when I was in college. Next thing I know, I'm sitting down in Vietnam, and I had never met no Vietnamese people in my life. But we fighting for reasons that we shouldn't have been fighting for. So, you know, if the people in the Arab countries are angry with the United States, they have a right to be, because every time, you know, one of those planes take off from Israel with the Star of David underneath the belly of the plane, it says made in the USA.
Yeah.
It's going to bomb some poor village and some poor kids that has nothing to do with nothing. He has no reason, I mean, he has no way to get away from those bombs. But the whole thing is that you mentioned that a lot of people making money. You're right. You know, the biggest company over there in Iraq right now was headed by Cheney.
Yeah,
Cheney
well,
made a bunch of millions of dollars since all of this stuff started.
That's a good point, Floyd. Yeah, thanks. So I think we all agree with
it's
that.
Free for all.
Yeah, right. I want to go and you know, about Ibrahim segment with Ibrahim Deek also about reconstruction of Lebanon. You know, the Lebanese keep you know, reinventing themselves from the ashes, so to speak. You know, just like that mythic bird.
Phoenix,
the phoenix. In Arabic, al-waqwaq. So anyway, Ibrahim Deek on reconstruction and so on.
Yeah, there will be more money coming in. I think sincerely a lot of Arab countries, you know, Dubai, Qatar, specifically Qatar, which have relationship with Israel, are very sympathetic to what happened to Lebanon, and they are doing reconstruction right now. There have been some mega hotel started before, and another one is going to start again. And there is money gift to Lebanon. Saudi Arabia gave them $500 million in gift. Kuwait $250 million. Saudi Arabia put $1 billion in the Lebanese Federal Reserve Central Bank. Kuwait put $500 billion to prop the Lebanese pound. Qatar promised to build a whole village. You know, they chose one, Marjayun, and they said to the government, choose one for us and we rebuild it. And so there is a lot of money coming in, and there will be reconstruction. But you need the root cause to disappear. You want peace in the area, the whole area. And so this doesn't happen again. And I mentioned that, how that could happen. Israel withdrawing from all the occupied land, and the Arab will open diplomatic and business relationship with Israel, and they will live in the area. They belong all to the same area. Israel is not imposed on them anymore. They are not afraid of it anymore. But this doesn't negate the losses Lebanon had paid. 1,287 Lebanese died. That's the official count. You know, from those 1,287, you know, they are mostly civilian. 1,140 are civilian. And then 4,054 wounded. Some of them very heavily wounded, you know, handicapped for life. And so these are costs the Lebanese paid, and you cannot reconstruct that.
Yeah, so it gives us an idea about in terms of the politics that's happening right now. But here it's a dangerous world still, a dangerous region, because not only that, it's Afghanistan and Iraq and Lebanon and maybe Iran and Syria, etc. That would be expansion of the conflict, but maybe all these things would fuse together to have like a major conflagration. Yes. I mean, it's not beyond the realm of possibilities. This is the main danger, So I want to go to another segment with Ibrahim and talking about, the comparison between displacement of Israelis during the fight and the Lebanese displacement.
It's really funny to hear somebody saying, well, Israelis were displaced. Yes, they were displaced. Maybe about 500,000 people moved from their homes, but maybe 99.9% of their homes were still there. And so they left, and this displacement, the Israeli economy suffered, but did not suffer destruction and loss for a long time to come. So it's not balanced. It's not the same thing. It's not the same. Lebanon did not occupy Israel. Lebanon did not destroy Israel. The Lebanese army and the government have nothing to do with what happened to Israel. What happened to Israel was caused by Israel. So the Hezbollah got 2 soldiers. Hezbollah is the guilty one according to the Israeli and the United States government. Go after them. Go kill the fighter of Hezbollah. Don't go after all the civilian of Lebanon and the infrastructure. I'm an American citizen. I was far away from, about 30 miles from the fighting, and I could have been killed at any time if I drove on the road. I didn't dare drive to go to Beirut to be evacuated. And I'm a civilian, I'm not a fighter. And I'm Christian, I'm not Shiite or Muslim. I'm a US citizen.
Well, what else can you say?
Yeah, well, this reminds me of one of the news items, that there was a news correspondent visiting Israel, and he wanted the Israelis to show him where the damages to the Israeli villages have been that were incurred as claimed by Israel. So he was told there is no use going there because it's already repaired. I mean, in a few days. That means how can you compare that to the damages that happened in
right? Yeah. So yeah, the point is, I mean, when people talk about like Hezbollah did whatever they did on July 12th, and Israel suffered, etc., and we have the right to defend ourselves. Bush's statement to Israel has the right to defend by killing civilians and so on. But the danger again is that this might be a larger conflagration. Any thoughts on those issues, Farideh?
Well, the larger thought here is that what United States and Israel are doing in the Middle East through military means is one thing, which is obviously by itself it's extremely dangerous and causes obviously tremendous amount of pain. But added to that is the language that is then used by the Bush administration that even causes the pain to be even deeper. That is to say, imagine yourself being a Lebanese, as you say, sitting in Lebanon, seeing your country destroyed, and then you hear the American president saying Israel has the right to defend itself by destroying your country. This is what I consider to be the cause of anger. Double standards and very, very inflammatory language that actually completely does not see the other side of the story.
Yeah, so we're almost flat out of time, but I just wanted to say that the main problem is still the Palestinian problem. Solve this, a lot of other things will be solved.
This is
and then the other question is, are we in the United States safer now than we were before all these issues happened. Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, and so on.
Not according to Bush himself.
Well, okay.
Even Bush himself is saying that they are going to come for us.
Okay. Thank you for coming, and thanks for our viewers, and see you next month.
Thank you for having us.